Once upon a time, the Prime Minister called for a high-wage economy. But is that out of reach for millions now as the government calls for wage restraint and the rail strike kicks off? So will this be the summer of strikes? I'll be speaking to the government and the head of the rail union, the RMT. Also tonight, the UN whistleblowers who are all fired after appearing in this BBC documentary.
The idea is to try to discredit the whistleblower. It's about a culture of fear.
And as we're harking back to the 70s, remember this and this. And this. I'll be asking the former Blue Peter presenter Peter Purvis and the former Vogue editor-in-chief Alexander Schulman if there was more to the 70s than strife. Good evening. We're moving inexorably towards midnight and the biggest rail strike in almost 30 years. The shutdown will affect up to 50,000 rail workers, and if talks fail again, there's the prospect of a repeat performance of the three-day action over the next few weeks. The government says it's staying out of the dispute and insists its plans for the rail industry reforms will create a sustainable, growing railway. Network Rail, which is responsibility of the government, is looking to make £2 billion of savings over the next 2 years. The RMT union points to high inflation and wants a pay increase that reflects that. So why have the talks been so unproductive? I'll be asking the head of the RMT and a government minister, but first here's our political editor, Nick Watt.
I won't be able to get to work during those days.
I had to change my trip to see my family and my grandma over the weekend and move it coming back a day earlier, so I missed meeting my sister's boyfriend and stuff.
I am for the railway because they haven't had a rise in a long time.
Personal stories echoed around the country, making plans in Merseyside for railways at a standstill. Irritation for some, understanding from others. But a week of disruption to the arteries connecting Britain. Is this a return to the strike-plagued 1970s as other workers plan industrial action too? Criminal barristers are to go on strike after being offered a 15% pay rise. They want 25% because they say some of them earn no more than the minimum wage. Teachers are threatening to strike unless they are awarded a rise of up to 12%. Their unions say wages have fallen by a fifth in real terms in the last decade. And nurses want a pay rise of 5% above inflation to make up for low wages. Demands driven by the spike in inflation, which is due to hit 11% in the autumn.
No, absolutely not.
The government says high wages would risk fueling inflation.
We have to recognise if we're going to forestall the evil of inflation, and inflation destroys savings, it destroys growth, it damages any economy where it gets an endemic grip, then we are going to have to show collective, society-wide responsibility.
A change of tune from Boris Johnson's promise last year.
That is the direction in which this country is going now, towards a high-wage, high-skill, high productivity and, yes, thereby a low-tax economy. The great ambition...
And that mantra perhaps explains why the Prime Minister played down talk of rising inflation at the time. When the facts change, as the old saying goes, I change my mind. And so Boris Johnson now believes that high wages would be damaging for the economy. Quite a shift for the politician who built his reputation as the boosterist leader and who, according to one cabinet minister, is pretty left-wing when it comes to economics. But this is also a challenging moment for Labour. The Tories want to link them to the strikes. And so tonight, Keir Starmer has told his front benchers, steer clear of picket lines.
What we're seeing is...
One economist says we've seen nothing like this in decades.
What we're experiencing now is very unlike anything we've seen in the last 30 or
40 years, certainly during my lifetime, a situation where we do have high levels of inflation with the global economies, particularly the global north, struggling for supply to match demand. So central banks like the Bank of England, for the first time in a very long time, are having to actively step in to try and dampen down demand in the economy.
The big squeeze that we're seeing...
An economist who's advised Labour is cautious about drawing comparisons with the 1970s.
The big difference between the 1970s and now is that workers have a lot less power in the labour market. So they're not able to negotiate big price rises. And I think the bigger risk is not that we're going to see a wage price spiral, is the fact that there's not going to be enough money in people's pockets in order to spend in the economy.
Balmy summer evenings in abundance, but the political world is now bracing itself for an unpredictable economic summer of discontent.
Nick, well, I'm joined now by Mick Lynch, who is the General Secretary of the RMT Union, and we'll be speaking to the Government Minister, Chris Philp, in a moment. Mick Lynch, first of all, thank you very much for coming in. If nothing comes of this strikes, you said you're going to go on. So lower paid workers are going to suffer, perhaps repeatedly, because you're insisting on striking.
Well, we regret that, and lower paid workers need a pay rise, as do my members. Our campaign...
And you're accepting that they are not the lowest paid workers, your members?
Some of our members are on very low pay. We've got cleaning members that are on minimum wage. We've got catering workers...
But not most of them?
Not most of them, no. Most of them are on moderate wages between 25 and 31,000. And the median wage for a railway worker in this dispute is £31,000. So
we've just had a cabinet briefing, what was going to be discussed tomorrow morning. And just to be clear, this is not a dispute just about wages. This is also about modernisation. And the Prime Minister is going to say tomorrow at Cabinet, I want to be clear, we're not lowering higher fares on passengers to carry on paying for working practices that date back in some cases to the 19th century.
Well, that's nonsense. We're hearing a lot of nonsense from the government today. We make agreements with companies all of the time. And if you look at the key workforce in the Network Rail side of this dispute, we made a new agreement with the company in 2010 and 2011. So there is a brand new set of working arrangements.
10 years ago?
Yes, but
things
they don't
move fast.
Yes, but they do not date back to the 1919, which Chris Philp came out with today. Grant Shapps came out with the same stuff. These are modern agreements. We have modern technology. We have technology deployed for automatic train testing, for ultrasonic testing, for track inspections. So this idea that somehow we're riding around promoting Stephenson's rocket is a mixture of hype and fantasy from the government, and you're going to hear a lot more of it in the next portion of this programme. People just making stuff up for the sake of it.
Well, we haven't, to be fair to Chris Philp, he hasn't actually spoken yet. Passenger numbers are down. The OBR says they're down by £2 billion a year for pounds. Who is going to pay that? You know,
well, passengers numbers are down, Kirsty, because the government told people to stay at home rather than go to work during the COVID crisis.
Which was the right thing to do.
Exactly. We support that. And we worked with Grant Shapps. He spoke to me at the time, along with the rail minister at the time, to get a set of COVID arrangements that would keep the railway going. Our members worked entirely during that. They weren't furloughed. They worked their shifts 24/7 round the clock. Now, their reward for that is to have the conditions ripped up, have their jobs threatened, thousands of jobs. Tonight, at talks with Network Rail, they've issued me a letter saying that there are going to be redundancies starting from July the 1st. So rather than trying to come to an agreement in this dispute, they've escalated it by giving us formal notice of redundancy amongst our Network Rail members.
Paul Scully on LBC tonight was asked about Tory MPs saying that they were banning strikes in essential services, and Paul Scully seemed to suggest that that was actually not such a bad idea.
Well, that's the kind of government that we've got. Every time they get a problem or they're losing an argument, they seek to change the law. Grant Shapps said he was going to ban the practices that P&O carried out. We've not heard a thing since. And all those people have lost their jobs. And now they want to legalise the practices that P&O carried out against our members.
If you got a guarantee that the government would come to the table and sit down along with Network Rail and yourselves, would you consider pulling the strike?
The government is at the table virtually. Every time they leave the room for an adjournment, they go and speak to the DfT and the Treasury, and they are pulling the strings in this dispute. If the management were allowed to negotiate freely under their own cognizance, we could get a settlement to this dispute very quickly.
Would you, if there were reasonable issues about working practices, and would you agree to them?
We will negotiate working practice change with the companies, and we're doing that all of the time, across the railway and across all the transport sectors we deal with.
Do you, looking at the wider firmament of what's happening in the industry just now, I mean, if others followed your lead to industrial action, you know, we're talking about inflation-based demands. If every worker asked for 11%, inflation would be baked in, and that would be bad for everybody.
Well, most public sector workers and many private sector workers have not had a proper pay rise since Cameron and Osborne were elected. We've had austerity visited on working people for 12 years. Pay is falling year on year. We have full employment and falling pay. We've got working people doing full-time jobs, claiming state benefits and going to food banks. That is intolerable, and we have to address that through people's pay packets.
What do you say, though, to other industries, companies, workers? They've got to prepare for this to happen again. If you don't get what you want this time, you will do another 3-day strike within the next, what, 4 or 5 weeks?
We will keep our campaign going, and others will join us. ASLEF are balloting, TSSA are balloting, Unite are balloting.
And you said right at the beginning of the interview that low-paid people will suffer because they're going to lose things over the next 3 days. Are you prepared for that to happen again to them?
Low-paid people, too, need to organise so that they can get a decent pay rise. If they're not organised, they won't be bargaining, they'll be begging. And that's the problem in this country. People have been destabilised by working practices. They've been destabilised by low pay and insecure employment.
But just one more time.
We need to change that, and the trade unions are the best way to deliver that change.
Yes, but just one more time. You've got a window on the basis of this ballot for more strikes. Will you do another 3-day strike?
We will plan our strike action after this phase, and we will carry on with industrial action until we've delivered a solution for our members.
Thank you very much. Chris Phil, what are the 19th century practices specifically? Boris Johnson says there's 19th century practices. Give me one example.
Well, some of the new things we'd like to introduce include using drones, for example, to do track inspections, which are safer.
But what
the ban on mandatory Sunday working goes back to 1919, which is early 20th century. I accept. Look, modernisation is on mandatory Sunday working. Modernisation is really important because in any industry, if you want to see higher wages or indeed lower train tickets for the public, you need to embrace modernisation. And when those proposals have been put to various unions, we get constant resistance.
But isn't it saying 19th century practices? Isn't that designed? This is quite a robust cabinet briefing. Is this not designed to be, well, inflammatory?
No, it's designed to make the point, the reasonable point, that if we're going to see wage increases or indeed lower ticket prices for customers, you've got to modernise and become more productive, as almost every other industry in the United Kingdom has.
Will there be compulsory redundancies?
Well, so far there haven't been. I think they made a sort of call to find out who wanted to take voluntary redundancy. About 5,000 people came forward, about half of whom have gone through the process. But I think we should keep in mind right now the people tomorrow, the patients looking for hospital treatment, the pupils needing to do their GCSEs, people trying to get to their own place of work who are not going to be able to do so because of this militant strike.
But you remember in February 21, Grant Shapps saying, transport heroes are on the front line keeping the country moving. These sound like hollow words now.
They're not hollow words. The words were absolutely meant. But if we're going to see pay increases in any sector, that needs to be backed by improvements in productivity, which means modernisation. It means using more technology. It means acknowledging when changing patterns, like buying tickets online, for example, mean we don't need as many people in the ticket office and we can instead deploy people elsewhere. It just means moving with modern times. That's not an unreasonable thing to ask for. And the people who are suffering are the patients that need to get to hospital, the pupils that need to get to school. And let's be clear, the median salary of all railway workers, it's £44,000 a year. That's far more.
To be fair, that is taking a lot of drivers.
The drivers are on 60,000.
Hang on,
they're on 60,000.
They're not. Most of them in RM.
$500,000.
They're not on. They're not in RMT. Most of them, as you know, they're in ASLEF. Can I just put this to you? What Mick Lynch is saying is that actually you are in the negotiations because you're partial. You're in the negotiations on one side. You're actually taking part because you are putting certain pressures on Network Rail and so forth. We know that. Could not you go to the table? If Mick Lynch says that he would be at the table with you, would it not be a good idea, in order to avoid these strikes, to go to the table?
Well, I mean, Mick Lynch has previously said he would not negotiate with the Tory government. The head of the, you've said that. The head of the, let me finish the point. Hang on, let me finish the point. The head of the rail delivery group this morning on the Today programme said that he didn't want the government in the negotiation. We've made money available to the railway industry. It's up to the employers to negotiate with the trade unions. And what happened this afternoon was halfway through these negotiations, while they were ongoing, the unions came out onto the street and gave an impromptu press conference, I mean, there's TV footage, saying that the strike was going to continue.
OK, let's just pause. Hang on.
I mean, it's on video.
Now, Mick Lynch, excuse me. Mick Lynch, I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you a question. Would you be prepared to negotiate with the Tory government, yes or no?
Absolutely. I've met every Tory transport minister in the last year, bus, rail, maritime and the Secretary of State. We've never said we won't meet the Tories. What we said was that they're not at the table. I'm negotiating with the employers. You've also lied that we left negotiations on Saturday and went to a rally. There were no negotiations scheduled for Saturday. You are a liar.
Right, let's just hang on. There's a video of him walking out this afternoon giving a press conference. It's on videotape.
And then we went back to the talks.
Yeah, having said the strike's going to go ahead.
You are a liar.
OK, well, let's
just... the strikes were going to go ahead.
And you're a liar.
Let's
it's on video.
You're a liar. We were back at the talks this afternoon. We've just left them. And your Network Rail managers delivered statutory redundancy notices to us.
Chris Phillips, let's just talk about the high-wage, high-skills workforce. Let's talk about high-wage, high-skilled workforce. That is what Boris Johnson called for. We're running inflation at 11%. What do you think would be a reasonable increase in wages when we've got that? You're wanting a high-skilled economy. You want to show confidence in your workers. So what is a reasonable amount?
Well, let's start with what we are doing. So the minimum wage for people on lowest incomes, which is obviously not rail workers because their median wage is £44,000 as we've established.
We've put up
the minimum wage over the last 10 years from £5.93 an hour to £9.50. The increase in the last year was about 7%. So we're helping the workers on the lowest wages. In terms of the immediate...
But these are skilled workers as well.
Let me finish, Kirsty. But in terms of the cost of living challenges that we now have, which are common to the whole Western world, it's happening in France and Germany and the United States. We're putting £37 billion into those people's pockets, whether it's the 5p cut on fuel duty, whether it's the £650 for universal credit for people on lower incomes, the £400 grant for fuel bills, the £150 on council tax. We're helping people, particularly on lower incomes, get through this situation. But to come to your question, wage rises, you can't, in any economy, private sector or public sector, you can't have wage increases sustainably unless they're backed by improvements in productivity. Whether that's companies...
But that's teachers, that's teachers, that's health service workers. They would say, particularly health service workers, their productivity is incredibly high. They're going to be wanting wage increases like this as well.
So the point is it has to be productivity backed, hence the talks about modernisation. But look, if you come to the... if we give everyone an across-the-board pay increase, right, two things are going to happen. Firstly, ordinary taxpayers are going to pick up the bill. And secondly, what is currently, I think, a temporary inflation spike caused by the Chinese COVID problems, Ukraine and so on, will become permanent because the wage increases will then fuel more inflation. It's like a dog chasing its tail. It'll become permanent and that will help nobody.
Thank you both very much indeed. A documentary by the BBC on whistleblowing at the UN has revealed shortcomings in the way revelations are managed. The film showed that the UN has no independent mechanism for whistleblowers. Staff complaints can only be investigated internally, and the most serious allegations are examined by the Office of Internal Oversight Services. It has no legal powers and is not accountable to any other organisation. The contributors who took part in the documentary all used to work for the UN. They allege a wide range of sexual abuse and corruption across many UN agencies, including the Human Rights Council, the UN Development Programme and UNAIDS. Soon after being interviewed for this film, two were fired. And Martina Bostrom, a senior advisor for UNAIDS, who claimed that she'd been sexually abused by a senior official and had her claim recognised by the UN, was also fired.
The idea is to try to discredit the whistleblower. It's about a culture of fear.
Sexual abuse, exploitation and harassment in the UN happens in headquarters. It happens Monday to Friday.
Whistleblowers are often presented as somehow hating the UN altogether and wanting it to be disbanded. That nothing could be further from the truth. We just want it to be better.
The UN has protected legal status. Senior members of staff have diplomatic immunity from national laws everywhere. And no one working for the UN can be questioned or arrested without the UN removing their immunity. Emma Riley worked for the UN for 10 years as a human rights officer. Her job involved trying to protect vulnerable groups, such as the Uyghurs in China, who speak out against repression. A Uyghurs delegation was due to attend a meeting at the UN Human Rights Council. Emma says she received an email in 2013 from the Chinese delegation requesting their names as a favour.
And my immediate reaction was, of course, we are not telling you that. There had been stories of people's families being arrested, tortured, detained, disappeared. We had a meeting with a Chinese delegate where he asked for the information, and we gave the distinct impression that he wouldn't be getting it. And they sort of indicated a bit of a quid pro quo without saying it. You know, they talked about the possibility of increasing their funding to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Just after that meeting, they invited the then High Commissioner for lunch. And my boss overruled all of us and gave him the names.
Dalkan was a known Uyghur activist.
Birleşken Milletler Teşkilatı'nın xadimleri eğer manga okşaydigan bir faaliyetçinin, aktivistinin ismini Xitay hükümetiga bergen takdirinin üzde mening ve mening ailemning çoqum bir xatarga duch keldiganligini, ularga besim bo'ldiganligini ular yaxshi biladi deb o'ylayman.
Some years later, his mother was held and died in a detention camp. His father died in unknown circumstances. His younger brother disappeared, and his older brother, he says, was sentenced to 17 years in a camp.
Some of the responses I've had from UN managers have been disgraceful. I mean, the person who has ultimate responsibility for ensuring that people are kept safe if they interact with UN human rights mechanisms told me that according to his information, nobody had been exposed to additional danger.
The UN says since late 2015, there has been no confirmation to member states of the names of participants at council sessions, and they are not aware of any individual addressing the council being placed in danger due to actions taken by them. The High Commissioner at the time rejects any improper action with regards to human rights defenders.
John O'Brien spent 12 years working at the UN. He was the regional technical advisor for climate change mitigation from 2009 to 2020.
The job involves developing proposals for new projects to do with energy efficiency, sustainable transport, renewable energy, and getting the funding approved and then doing the oversight. It's not a story about corruption in Russia. It's more a story about cover-up inside the UN. And the real crime is that there's been such a huge effort to cover it up. I first realised there was problems around 10 years ago, payments with no reports that made no sense. No one was doing anything about it, so on one project, a 23-year-old university student was hired to manage a $5.4 million project, and when I protested, I was told to keep quiet. On another project, there were all these friends and family contracts, which included a mother, a daughter, a son. One senior official told me, "We all know there's corruption in Russia. Our job is to stay as far away from it as possible. So John, keep quiet. We don't want to report it."
He said in 2014 a consultant was hired to look at the project, and he concluded that it was a money laundering scheme. John says he sent the report to supervisors, but they did not reply.
The United Nations Development Programme says they have demonstrated full and unreserved determination to address accountability and systemic issues. It says allegations of attempts to cover up corruption have been dealt with and appropriate action taken. The UNDP disputes John O'Brien's account and says he was not told to keep quiet about his concerns.
Their idea in dealing with whistleblowers is they must destroy the individual by any means necessary.
In 2021, the UN held a virtual meeting on mistreatment of Uyghurs in China.
On the 12th of May 2021, the UN had its only meeting to date on the situation in Xinjiang. It was organised by the US, British and German delegations.
This combination of atrocities amounts to the crime against humanity.
I had registered to attend, and registering to attend means that I would have been able to take the floor. And the UN was aware that I was likely to bring up its policy of handing names to China.
We welcome everyone to visit Xinjiang, but we oppose any kind of investigation based on lies.
So 5 minutes into the meeting, which I was attending remotely, there's a knock on my door, and I open it, and I'm very surprised to see 2 Swiss police.
Vous êtes chez moi, je ne veux pas de vous chez moi, je vous ai pas invité à entrer.
And that they were there to take me, basically against my will, to a mental hospital. So effectively the UN tried to have me sectioned.
Emma says the UN had sent the Swiss police to her home on the premise she was suicidal, a tactic, she says, to prevent her from taking part in the virtual meeting. The UN says Miss Riley is not recognised as a whistleblower.
It's much easier just to try to discredit the whistleblower, think about it, than to allow the truth to come out.
In 2018, John attended a UN meeting in Paris.
Someone came up behind me, took photos of me, and said that I was looking at naked women and had arranged to go and meet a prostitute, which is ridiculous.
These photos were sent to the UN and John was investigated.
So it's a very clear case of malicious reporting. And I can show from the WhatsApp chat and from my friend's testimony that I went to see my friend across the road and took a taxi to Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport and went back to Istanbul. And the UNDP just ignores the evidence.
John says the UN requested an interview with his girlfriend whilst she was in hospital.
And it's absolutely outrageous and absolutely unacceptable that they're trying to interview a terminally ill person, and it's absolutely unacceptable. She died, yeah. I don't want to talk about it.
The United Nations says Mr. O'Brien's allegations of retaliation are without merit and said his assessment of the situation with his girlfriend is misleading.
When I moved to headquarters, I worked quite closely with management of the organization. And there was a manager there, a senior manager. He was in fact one of the top ranking officials of the United Nations. His name was Luis Lores. He was sleazy in his way, and he felt himself entitled to be able to comment on your looks, look you up and down, give you a kiss, but instead of doing the air kiss from left to right, he would be able to try to kiss you right there on the side of your lips.
Martina Bostrom had worked for the UN for 14 years as a senior advisor to UNAIDS. In 2015, she was in Thailand attending a work event. Dr. Luis Lures was also attending.
As part of leaving the work meeting and we're going down the same elevator, he attacks me in the elevator. He comes at me all of a sudden. He tries to forcibly kiss me. He tries to touch me on my breasts and on my body. And then he tries to drag me out of the elevator towards a long corridor of his room. I push back.
Martina reported Assistant Secretary General Luis Lures. She spoke with UN investigators after launching a formal complaint.
There has been an institutional review. They've established that there was a toxic work culture, that there was a boys' club, that there has been severe abuse of power. All of that has been factually established. And to this day, the only one who has been fired has been me.
The United Nations says allegations of harassment against Dr. Lores were investigated, but at this time the UN is not in a position to comment on the veracity of these claims. Dr. Lores says, "I have never harassed nor assaulted anyone. The accusations made are unfounded."
In August 2021, Martina received a letter from the UN that accepted that she was sexually harassed over a protracted period of time. But in regards to the allegation in 2015, the findings did not meet the evidentiary standards. Perna Sen used to be the UN's spokesperson on sexual harassment. She left the organisation under 2 years ago and is now calling for an external panel to investigate these allegations.
I think they're brave, actually, to speak. The United Nations needs to step up its work towards making real change. And I think the way in which that can be moved really urgently is that a group of people, you can call them a panel, call them a commission, whatever you like, but a group of people external to the United Nations who don't have an investment in a job in it and so on, can sit and pull together a lot of the things that have been said, a lot of things that have been criticised about how the UN works and so on. And I would like the Secretary General to commit to taking this on board and acting on it.
The UN says the Secretary General takes extremely seriously the need to have accountability within its own ranks by protecting whistleblowers and investigating thoroughly the allegations that they bring up. The UN also remains open to any external review of our efforts to combat misconduct of any kind.
This isn't just a case of the UN being nasty to one whistleblower or to 7 whistleblowers or to 20 whistleblowers. This is about making sure that nobody ever speaks up about anything.
And you can watch the full version of The Whistleblowers Inside the UN on BBC Two tomorrow at 9 o'clock, or it's on BBC iPlayer right now. Curiouser and curiouser. A story appeared very briefly in the first edition of The Times on Saturday, which alleged that in 2018, when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, he floated the idea of a job for his then mistress, now his wife, Carrie Johnson, as his Chief of Staff. The story was pulled from subsequent editions after Number 10 spoke to The Times, and Carrie Johnson's team denies the claims. Nick is back. Nick, what's going on?
Well, The Guardian is talking about the Streisand effect, which is you try to stop publication of something, you end up getting a lot more publicity about it. So Simon Walters, who wrote this story, he's a veteran Westminster journalist. I know him well. And he has a long track record of breaking true stories. He did that for many years at the Mail Group, and a number of his stories in recent years have focused on Carrie Johnson. In recent months he's been working on a freelance basis, so not for the Mail Group, and that what he was doing here. He was developing a story about Carrie Johnson that first appeared in Lord Ashcroft's biography of her. Now, Dominic Cummings, who for about a year was Boris Johnson's policy chief in Number 10, he says this story was true. Important to say, though, that Dominic Cummings was not working for Boris Johnson at the time that this story allegedly happened, because obviously, of course, he was Foreign Secretary at the time. Now, Simon Walters is nothing if not thorough. And as I understand it, in the 2 days before publication of his story, so that's on Thursday and Friday, he spoke to the political side of Downing Street. That's obviously relating to Boris Johnson. No on or off the record denial was offered, I understand. On the day before publication, he spoke to Carrie Johnson's side of Downing Street. No on-the-record denial was offered, I am told. And what appears to have happened is that it was not until the early evening of Friday that the Carrie Johnson team clocked that Simon Walters was placing this article in the Times. And that apparently took it to a wholly different level for them. Now, on newspapers, you have very early deadlines on Fridays, particularly for stories on inside pages. I can testify to that as a former newspaper person. And so by the time that the Carrie Johnson team sort of swung into action, the story may well have been set. And as I understand it, a very forthright denial about the story went directly to the Times. And if you have a categorical denial from somebody acting on behalf of the subject that you're writing about it, then your in-house lawyers are going to take a very, very close look at that.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Now, will the rail strike presage a summer of discontent with claims of pay and conditions piling up from junior doctors to teachers to barristers to NH staff more broadly? Commentators are raising the spectre of a return to the 70s. But the 70s weren't all bad. After all, there was glam rock and the Sex Discrimination Act and The Godfather, and Play for Today.
I had an accident and I woke up in 1973.
The talk is all about going back to the 70s. And it certainly gave John Sim a bit of a shock. But it wasn't all bad. It was a time of invention, when music was about characters and clothes and stories, and icons were born. And the atmosphere in the hot summer was febrile. In June 1976, the temperature soared with a record that still stands, 35.6 degrees in Southampton Mayflower Park. Some areas had no rain for weeks and weeks. A Swedish band took the Eurovision Song Contest by storm with a song using a metaphor of a battle for a love affair. Jesus Christ. We indulged our newfound penchant for rock concept albums. And sporting prowess was, perhaps for the first time, not all about men. Icons too on television.
Your name will also go on the list. What is it? Don't tell him, Pike. Pike.
And playwrights satirised the new middle classes for their snobbery and affectation. Our fascination with other worlds was taken to a different level. We started to see how much tech would transform our lives.
And it's ringing in the studio.
Hello, John Noakes here.
And the masses celebrated a mere quarter of a century of the monarch's reign. Well, we're joined now by Peter Purves, Blue Peter presenter from 1967 to 1978, and the former editor-in-chief for Vogue magazine, Alexander Shulman. Good evening, both of you. Peter Purves, first of all, you were on Blue Peter then. It was a decade of strikes, but how did you see it? What do you remember?
Funnily enough, I don't really remember directly it being a dreadful time. I know it was, because I'm the 70s, 1972, I think there was Bloody Sunday, all sorts of things, government changes. I remember Harold Wilson coming in with a new government, and two years later he retired from politics. All sorts of things were going on. We joined the European community, and we were part of what was then the common market. It was a strange time. I don't really remember much about the strikes and things, although occasionally it affected us in the studio. They were going on, and it was a fairly bleak and miserable time in lots of ways. But you've just itemised some of the wonderful things about it.
Well,
music was fantastic, and it's great.
Well, Alexander Shulman, you were getting ready for work. You were still too young to do that. But what was it that struck you? Because when I look back now, it was about the colour, it was about the music, and it was about the characters behind the music.
Oh, I think that the 70s have remained sort of the most influential in terms of kind of culture and style to me. I think when I was like in my teens then, and I think whatever era you're a teenager sort of informs you really for the rest of your life. So I feel incredibly lucky that we had things like David Bowie, Roxy Music, Patti Smith, Joni Mitchell, the Eagles, all of this incredible music, but also incredible movies. You know, I was having a look at the movies that came out, like The Godfather, Jaws, incredible new kind of drama, really highly dramatic with lots of special effects. Alien came out then, Star Wars. So we were spoilt for choice, actually. Tons of great stuff.
And of course, the Star Wars is actually still in the public imagination, consciousness, and on our screens all these years later. Peter Purves, tell me though about technology. I mean, Blue Peter often looked at technology, and there were huge technological advances.
Well, there were. I can remember demonstrating the first domestic video recorder, because until then, unless you saw a show go out on television, you didn't get a chance to see it. You couldn't record them at home. It was a fairly large wooden box made by Philips with a gigantic cassette that was about the size of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I mean, it was a weird time. And of course, you just showed. I heard a little clip there with John Noakes answering the phone. I was out in the garden demonstrating. You could actually have a telephone which you could take outside. What is it? Absolutely incredible stuff.
But the other thing was, and I can remember this, was Concorde. It was extraordinary. The idea that we, I mean, with the French, of course, created Concorde was just something out of this world.
Oh, absolutely. And I remember we did a feature on in the morning. We went to Heathrow and filmed on Concorde on the ground. Leslie Judd then boarded. We went back to the studio, and by the time we got back to the studio, she was in Boston, and we did her landing there and did a link. Again, that was fairly original as well. Being able to do a link with America live. Wow, that was tremendous stuff.
And at the same time, Alexander, there were pubs that wouldn't open their doors to women still then. There were lots of things that were wrong. But there was the Sex Discrimination Act. There was change as far as women were concerned. Women were actually being actively welcomed into the workplace.
Yeah, and Germaine Greer's Female Unit was 1970, so that was sort of like a really, I think, sort of life-changing book for many women. And certainly, yeah, women's rights were marching ahead. I think what's really interesting about the 70s, though, is that they were very much, as most decades are, but they particularly a decade of two halves. So you had this rather kind of joyful, exciting, exuberant start.
First London Pride marches?
Yeah, exactly. And then it slides into a rather darker, sort of grim with Greenham Common, punk. Things just get nastier because too much bad stuff has happened by then. I mean, the decade started off optimistic, but then it turned.
But Peter, you worked for two very strong women at that time, one of whom was Biddy Baxter. These were women that were bucking the trend.
Yes, and very successfully too. I mean, Biddy Baxter was a tyro. I mean, she was amazing. She managed to not get any of the episodes of Blue Peter that she was involved in wiped from the big 2-inch tapes, which was mandatory. The BBC had to reuse those tapes. She managed to preserve every single episode of Blue Peter she was involved with, which was a remarkable achievement. And prior to that, in the 60s, of course, I'd worked with Verity Lambert, who became very powerful. And at the same time, when I was working on children's television at that time, Monica Sims was the head of children's television, head of the department. Women were making their mark. And I seem to remember, wasn't it the 70s when Billie Jean King took on Bobby Riggs, was it?
Yes. Well, I'm afraid our memories could go on forever, but thank you very much indeed. We've run right out of time. Not from the 70s, but from us right now. That's it. See you tomorrow. Goodbye.